Hi, everyone. This is Lee Perry, and I am cultivating culture shifts by interviewing some people that I find in the community who inspire me, who have amazing stories to tell, and help put things into perspective of some heavier thought that I have, and hopefully you have when you're listening and paying attention to these really awesome interviews. And I'm super excited to introduce my new friend, Stephen, who, Stephen, I met you at an Orlando YIMBY event, which I felt like is one cool place that's bringing like-minded people together. Tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your interests.
Sure. Yeah, Lee, it's great to talk to you about this. I'm so excited about this project. I think very cool things could come of it. So my interest is in quantification, like data-driven, big data, all the words that we use to signal that we're serious about the world and serious about making changes in the world. I'm trying to unpack what's going on with that because it feels so much like even when people have data, somebody comes at you and they say they have data too, and they disagree, and people cling to the stories that they want to tell and their understanding of the world. And so I'm trying to unpack, why does it feel like things are so stalled? Why does it feel like folks get timid, or why are things breaking down? My background is in education policy and demographics policy. So understanding the group, understanding the individual as they're coming up through education systems, getting ready to go out into the world and try to run organizations or just understand themselves in the world that we're trying to fix, because there's a lot, obviously, that's going wrong. Orlando YIMBY housing policy in Central Florida is obviously a pretty big mess. Education's a mess right now. What I've spent my time on is working on a book and researching the history of quantification, the history of these organizational cultures, trying to understand, okay, did we hit a limit somewhere? Is data really the stuff that we have to turn to get out of this, or are there alternatives? Are there stories that we need to expand and tell? And so that combination is what I study, what I'm trying to get at the heart of.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, when I first approached you and learned about what you do, I remember just asking, like, there's so many factors. We're human beings, and our scope of understanding as a specific topic is limited to the amount of resources that are put into a study, let's say, on a thing, say something like funding for schools. If you are trying to quantify need based on the data that is given and assessed, how you prioritize what factors you're actually going to deep dive into could really shift and alter human influence on our society. But I think that can be really powerful and really dangerous, especially when, I know in my experience in working with nonprofits, trying to raise money, you're sometimes going out of your way to prove that you deserve the funding based on the qualifications and the metrics needed in order to qualify for a grant, rather than being able to just get the funding and capacity that you need to do an amazing thing. If you amplify that across every industry, there's a lot of room for selective data collection and kind of leaving out important factors that can shift how funding and resources, time, energy, and priorities are being looked at, right?
Yeah, ideally we want it, evidence-based policymaking, right? But so often it's policy-based evidence making. People come in focused on, okay, this is what we're going to have to do, and maybe it's sneaky behind the scenes. All right, this is the evidence we need to collect to go with the thing that we were going to decide to do. Like, that happens all the time. The other thing is it's just it's our culture, right? We want to hold folks accountable. We want to show evidence that our programs are making a difference. And data, again, is kind of the supreme evidence that you can bring. But that comes with a lot of costs. The the amount of time that it takes to fill out grants or just find them. There's a lot of upkeep and a lot of slush to get through to just get the oil into the people actually running the machines who are doing the good work. And you're right, it's such a messy, sticky situation, and each domain is very different. The cultures of, all right, how do we decide who's going to get the funding, who's going to get the agency, who's got the best plan? And it's such like a black box, and there's so much room for communication errors there, I think.
Yeah, the more that I'm getting into politics and the more that I'm learning about things that are really intertwined, like housing and the environment and homelessness and how funding is prioritized. I always thought that there was only room for like corruption or mismanagement when it came to politics or money. And now I'm starting to see that who holds the data can sometimes have a power that might go unchecked, that can have such an influence. And this is why redistricting and the census data seems to be like such a contentious and controversial subject, which it really shouldn't. Like growing up, I always thought what's on paper, you have to trust the scientists and you have to trust data, right? Because what's on paper is scrutinized by whatever community is putting in the investment to get that data. But it sounds like sometimes it can be a blanketed way to turn a blind eye to other factors and ignore sometimes. We can get into more specific examples, but ignore sometimes some really major holes in the data collection process.
Yeah, so this is exactly what I study, is kind of the history of science and organizations, and our reliance on numbers to both understand the world and how the organization operates. And they're everywhere. They're in HR. They're in your metrics and your the things that you have to report, turnaround times. The dashboards that get made for people to at least appear like they understand things. But frequently what I found is we have a lot of data people, but not a lot of like statistics people or philosophy people who realize, okay, we have this data, but what data do we not have? What data can't we have? What things can't be quantified? And I think that's where there's like a lot of these hiccups and missed opportunities to help people get the services they need, where we just the data that would exist to help you, it can't be collected. It's too expensive to be collected, or we find political ways not to collect that data, or we find ways to collect data to support, again, the policies that we would use to actually hurt people, potentially. Data is in rhetoric about who gets to live where, it's and who gets to immigrate where, who gets to, the opportunities to go to school. And it's hard to find that language to talk about this because it's so expansive across domains. It's really like so hard to communicate, like just the scope of everything.
Well, I definitely want to go into like the philosophical challenges closer to the end of the conversation, because that's kind of where you and I left off, of like, really like, how do we know what we think we know if we don't know how we've prioritized data our entire beings? But, I think two examples that I've experienced, I'd love for you to get into some of the nitty gritty too of the examples that you've seen in your career. But two examples that I've seen in the biological and scientific community in terms of the environmental movement, there have definitely been private interests, which if you hear my dog walking around, just forgive that. There's definitely been, private interests in who wields the data around environmental studies when something like development or pollution takes place. And I've seen basically mismanagement of that study process, where you can be very selective on how you present reports in order to, that the people who are in power, who are going to use these studies to make decisions, aren't going to go line by line. They're not going to fact check and spend additional money to get a counter study, to make sure that the money they invested in that study originally to assess any environmental degradation before said thing was going to be built or whatever the study is for. It's like you just have to kind of cut the check and then just trust that this firm is going to come with hard facts that you can then use to make a decision to vote yes or no on a thing. And man, I have seen and heard stories of peers that have graduated wishing that they could like save the world in their environmental science degree and background, and end up feeling very betrayed because they end up joining like consulting firms and such that say like, hey, look over here, but don't look over here when you're collecting that data, because we really need to make sure the numbers come out right because of our funder. And I've also seen examples of, in the urban agriculture space, where, a lot of people are trying to say that investing in localizing our food system is going to be too expensive. And I try to explain to people, because they consult with me. I have experts in industries that I, would assume that they would know much more than me. And they ask me, what kind of funding would it take to be able to localize our food system at the level where we can create jobs and save money? Where would that money come from? Because growing produce right now is not something you can make a livable wage off of currently. And our economy is dependent on food prices to stay low enough so that people can survive. And then I just say, well, look at how much money is going into taking care of people who are living on the street, or, healthcare for those who can't afford it when they have diabetes, or all the food that's wasted and the time and energy and distribution funding that goes into moving food around for it to just end up in the landfill. I mean, there's so many data points that are not brought to the table when we're trying to go after, funding to change the system. And so I'm just curious if you have any kind of concrete examples of how data has been mismanaged.
Yeah, a lot of times it's so there's the appearance of responsibility, and then there's actually being responsible. Politics is a lot of time about blame. And so just to set this up for a second. So set responsibility next to accountability. Accountability is reliant on like data in this little example. You need to show your quantitative evidence. And if you can't, then we're going to hold you accountable and we're going to punish you. And responsibility would be more of a qualitative understanding of it, where you're not going to be able to show data points for every little thing or whatever, but you're allowed to say, hey, this is what we need to do to deliver this service to these people, because whatever the economic games that we have to play to distribute the things that these people need or that we need, this is not compatible with our ecology. The economics games that people invent, we can adjust those, but ecology is ecology. We have to build an economy that works with that ecology. I mentioned that email, but I am very influenced by Robin Kimmerer and her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which goes into like a philosophy of education, philosophy of science, of how indigenous perspectives work with what would typically be called Western approaches. And she's got this great layout where well-being, as she understands it, is like braiding rows of sweetgrass. And again, her understanding of what a well society is you get your ecology straight first, and what are your limits there? Then you build your economy. Then you spirituality is the third branch that she says. You need to feel like you're part of your society and you're part of your world. And when these things come together, you're doing great. If that is not the case, if there is a mismatch, if your economy is alienating folks, if you are not in sync with your ecology and you are collecting food in sustainable ways, growing food in sustainable ways, distributing it in sustainable ways, you're not working. So I think like the first thing to like trying to find ground there is it's an attitude adjustment to where, okay, we've done a lot of this like accountable stuff, economically responsible or whatever those, and they are games, right? They're not working. That's the first thing, is to flip that attitude of, okay, you're focused on these numbers, but you can't fool your environment. And I sympathize so much with like your friends who go into these consulting positions and they have to play these games where it's like, oh, look at these numbers, but not look at those numbers. Because it's so hard to get all of them on the table in front of somebody who needs to like understand how that system of things interact. That is so hard to communicate, because we don't, a lot of these things, I mean, you know, a conversation is great, but it might need to be 2 or 3 conversations, or a week of conversations and a week of site visits, and that back and forth. There's no shortcut to understanding this stuff. And that's like kind of what we want, is to like solve it in a meeting or solve it in a report, or like a stamp that says, hey, our plan is okay. And I think those shortcuts are just not working anymore. And I'd be curious on your thoughts about that, having a seat in front of, you know, all the county goings-ons. And
oh my God. Yeah. I need to read that book, because that is, you just put to words something that I feel, that I think the world feels, that I don't think we're really trained on how to deal with it. I feel like we're very sick as a species, and we're just kind of told this is the way that we survive. Don't you want to be like everyone else? But if you don't have those 3 points perfectly balanced, then you're unwell. And in my work at the county, you know, I have to say it is very, very hard to stare in the eyes of people knowing that the earth is not well, knowing that, and it's not just my opinion, knowing that there is scientific proof that things are not good right now on an economic and environmental and social level, but decisions are still being made as if we have to pretend that things are okay, and that things are the way they were back in the 50s, you know, when our code and everything was written. And, you know, we have to make huge, bold, innovative changes in order to heal. And it's just this old way of thought that helped build the foundation of our society is kind of stuck in this pattern. And so when you talked about working in the school system and how the data that you collected influenced what schools were prioritized and how they got funding, I couldn't help but wonder. And I'm going to throw this out there, and you can either shut it down or you could throw it in the sky.
Yep.
I have a lot of friends that are conspiracy theorists, and I believe that some things can exist and some things cannot exist at the same time. But there is something that really turns my stomach when I think about this conversation, because we've seen generationally certain information be removed from our academic world. We've seen civics taken out of schools. We've seen certain information kind of get watered down in our history through the years in public schools. And now when we bring in the experience that you brought up of how we prioritize data in order to figure out how schools perform based on whatever data is being collected, and I'd love to hear you talk about it. Is there something going on to basically, through generations, remove us from that sense of enlightenment or education that we need in order to fight the system at large? Are we purposefully being held in the dark?
It's hard to say. So there are, all right, the history of education in America in a nutshell, because this is, again, like, week, month, a year, a lifetime. Generally how it developed. Like, we are about 100 years into the formal education experience or experiment. And it came up in a time of ideas of scientific management. The idea that if you set up a system in the one correct way, a little generalized, but there, that it'll work for everyone. And to our credit, like, we understand that education is important. It's just been very heavy-handed and like one size fits all. And because education is a very radical experience, you are expanding your understanding of the world, your understanding of who you are and what you can do in it. Education can threaten status quos. And so this is where, like, some philosophy gets in. When you're setting up your education system, are you going to prioritize renewing the old ways of thinking, or are you going to encourage the development of kids who grow up to challenge the old ways? And there has always been that tension from the start. We all agree that education is good, we're going to fund it, but that tension between renew the old America and progress to the new, it goes back to like a John Dewey, where they're wrestling with these questions from the very beginning, and they've gone through different phases. And right now it is just so insane. I think there are so many different factions. So there are I think the cynical folks who know what they're doing, they are saying, okay, you can't be exposed to these ideas. These ideas are too dangerous. I think, like, that sneakiness exists. And then I think there are also true believers who say these ideas are whack. That this really is the good way of doing things, or the traditional way is good. And then you have, all right, like, again, I'm trying to cover a lot of history, but it's complicated, I guess, is my answer. It's very hard to pull off a conspiracy because of how many different interests are involved. But yes, there are bad faith actors in the education system who are pushing vouchers, or they just want, to set up contracts so that, buddies can get money or whatever. And then there are also philosophical people who say, oh yeah, we want vouchers because choice is good. And then, on your more liberal side, they say, oh, we want to standardize education because we want everybody on the same page in a democracy. And then there are other communities, they say, oh, we want, again, it's hard to cover, but, we want our own local school. Like, indigenous communities have wanted control over their classroom. And there's been a lot of violence in forcing, those communities to go into the Western American style schools. Recently, it's been about 30 years of the idea of this accountability test, standardized test. If we just collect the right data, that's the way to improve. And really, we've just kind of spun ourselves into anxiety. And there's been weird political bedfellows and political alliances to kind of get to where we are just watering down things into we legislate the curriculum and don't give teachers freedom or students freedom to go off and do their thing.
Yeah, but
so it's complicated.
There's two things that come to mind when you say that, specifically, since we're talking about data and how it influences education. One major thing is a factor that I don't think is quantified into a data point that would alter our society is, standardized testing. You brought up this accountability piece. What emotional toll is that creating? Generational trauma, because we're seeing higher levels of youth committing suicide and a lot of mental health challenges that we've never seen in previous generations at this level. Those factors, I don't think, are being directly correlated to the decision-making processes that are happening nationwide when it comes to how we prioritize standardized testing. So there's an example of like data points that I don't think people are prioritizing, and then how it can go wrong. I have a friend that I don't know the correct term, but he basically said that he was late a lot in school. He went to like a school that was already kind of had a lot of crime and had a lot of like drug issues and gang issues. And he was late a lot. And I guess his grades were slipping because he was in a single family home and whatever. He was immediately put in this like, I guess, juvenile detention version of a school. I guess it's like kind of for kids with behavioral issues where they really don't put in the resources that they would in a typical public school. It's more like a lot more punishments, like boys and girls can't play together. They have to be separate. They have to have uniforms. It was operated much more like a prison almost than an actual public school. And when I was asking, what did you do to get there? He just said, I had my grades are slipping and they didn't want the school to get withheld funding by having too many kids that were making us under a certain grade point average. So I was removed. And that really could have put him in a trajectory that a lot of the other students, because there he was getting into fights, he was getting bullied, and so, I think data can really be harmful too, if it's the key indicator of whether or not a school would get funding in this case.
Yeah, there's such a mismatch, or a mismatch, I should say, of different funding programs and schemes. I've heard stories of, just the scuttlebutt around FDOE, like schools will enroll kids in AP classes because they get higher credit hour allowances, but then they won't end up taking the test, and it doesn't matter what grade they get. Or, it'll be like a tech class and they say they're doing one program, but they really do like an easier one. Or they will, they will try to select their students if there's any kind of, control, like especially with like when school choice comes, or like lotteries come in certain systems. Principals are very aware of, just how high the stakes are for the perception of their school, the perception of their careers. And so shady things happen all the time. There's stories of teachers going back and erasing their students' standardized tests and marking the answers. There's the other stereotypical stuff where it's just test prep. So you prepare more for the structure of the question, or strategies like, eliminate these two and then guess between these two if you can, because you up your percentage. And when you get to that level of gaming the system, again, you've drifted from your purpose of, again, stimulating healthy developmental experiences for kids in your society. So there's lots of terms for this: quantifernia, Pittram-Sorkin, goal displacement, whatever you want to call it. It's messed up.
Yeah, but then you to go back to the first point that I made,
mm-hmm.
You have to ignore other correlated data that people aren't connecting the dots almost on purpose. Like, now that you've done that, our crime rate's going to be impacted in the next 10 years because now students are put in a trajectory where they're kind of set up to fail. Or, are the suicide rates of young kids going to go up because you've pressured them now to take AP classes because you want to get the funding? Like what long-term effects could be happening that aren't being factored into these decisions?
I think our school structures are absolutely related to how wound up everybody is and how paranoid everybody is. If you think about it, you are introduced to the data society, the metric society, whatever you want to call it, when the 6-year-old gets handed their first report card, and then they get the labels, so-and-so is proficient, not proficient, or whatever. And then you start getting A's and B's, C's, and then you get stamped with a number. This is how good you are. And those external things that we force on kids become wrapped up in their self-identity. They become wrapped up in their conception of what intelligence is, and how education works. Am I a smart kid? Am I a dumb kid? Am I a troublemaker? Am I a math person? Am I a reading person? It gets wrapped up in gender. As certain people more likely to be a math person or not? And this gets warped up in the psyches of kids. So Carol Dweck is kind of like a big psychologist. She like growth mindset is kind of her term. So the idea of a kid's theory of intelligence, is it fixed at birth, or is it like an incremental thing that you work on with practice? And the way the reality works, again, is the experience that you accumulate. You get more familiar with things and how the world works and how you exist in the world, for better and worse. Linking that later to crime or whatever, it gets more dubious the further out it is, because do we really have an education problem, or is it a housing problem? And is it an equity problem in the larger community? Is it, food scarcity? Is it, all these other things mismatch? And that's where the math gets a little dubious. You can isolate, things and tie them together. But again, that mathematics is a little flat for describing, really what we have with larger social problems, where we have trust issues with providing, folks what they need to feel safe through their education experience. To wrap up this little bit, like the common saying is like, if we educate folks in the right way, they can be lifted out of poverty. Like education lifts out of poverty, and really it's the other way around. I've worked with kids, they're thinking more about pantries than they are about their homework. They're thinking more about, how, whether their parent has a job or not, and whether they're being treated fairly at work. They're thinking about all that stress instead of getting lost in the amazing things that we have to learn. There's more pressing concerns. So how do you fix that? It's, you got to be generous with kids, I think. You got to make sure that they have stable housing. You got to make sure that they have food. And this is not a secret. Like you go back and read like the Greek philosophers, and they're listing out, okay, if you don't have shelter, food, and clothes, don't even worry about the other education stuff. And we kind of got lost somewhere that we thought we could cleverly, technocratically, education would be this magic thing, but it's really just, part of life. And if life is not good outside of school, it's really hard to like immerse yourself in the education stuff.
And it bothers me that I've seen time and time again, more vulnerable communities having less funding at their schools. Like if that is the truth, and we understand that there's a hierarchy of need, why are schools that are in the most critical space, in the most underserved conditions, getting the least amount of resources? I've worked in different schools where on one side of I-4, they have a culinary class where hardly any of the stoves work, and they have very limited resources, so they can't really do that much. Like they're really struggling to be able to provide things that they want to be able to provide to teach, people life skills on one side. And then I have another school in a predominantly upper to middle income community where they have a yoga studio and all of this incredible, now mind you, a middle school, not the high school on the other side of town that has very little, but I'm saying like they have literally like a yoga studio and they're doing video editing, and the students run, the eighth graders run their own camera equipment to do their morning news where they edit all the audio, and they just have this incredible studio with everything top of the line. And I'm like, how on earth did someone in the same school board make that executive decision to distribute funding when we know statistically that the zip codes that are needing that funding the most are on that other side of town? How did that happen?
It's racism in a word. You cannot understand why schools are the way they are, what like the entire concepts of school districts and school board, and like the whole structure of how they're governed is still linked to desegregating. It drove neighborhood development. It drove, local politics. And again, like even if folks go in and they think, the rules are, this rule doesn't mention race, or I'm a good person or whatever, we're still dealing with those consequences. And even if, your rules look okay, you can still select rules for their outcomes. And again, it's that appearance of, oh, we're doing this fairly, or oh, we're going to hold everybody accountable, or whatever. And there's so much of a buildup of that damage. And that's not to say that folks aren't doing good work in those schools, and that, that those experiences that those kids have and those teachers have aren't, valuable. Because that's another thing is, like, these schools are still part of the community. The names mean things. They mean more than just like the grades or the conditions. That's, a lot of the times this is where, your siblings went, or your older cousins, or even your parents. But allocating the resources that we need to get things to where they need to be, that is the tough project, right? How do you, crack these ideas about fairness and about where we are today? We're with all the critical race theory arguments today. I mean, that's invented to look at problems like this, where it appears to certain folks. You can point to your constituents, oh, the rules don't mention anything about race or whatever, but the consequences are still, that's why we need this language. We live in a democratic society, and this is,
Yeah, I was just about to say, because you just brought up a perfect point. Like, okay, it's racism on this hand, but then on this hand, if it's all data driven and numbers driven, how could there be bias? How could funding that's supposed to be turnkey, like if a robot were doing this decision-making process by looking at just sheer numbers, then everything would be distributed based on need. And obviously we would be putting more resources into these communities that are, predominantly of color, but that wouldn't be a factor.
So the idea that that we can calculate our way to a better world, or find the perfect algorithm, or eliminate bias, or whatever it is. I mean, this is extremely tricky to wrap your head around, because like you could have, you could look, if you're a committee, you could look at 10 algorithms, right? And each one, to somebody who doesn't have a chance to sit with you for an hour or a week or whatever, each of the 10 looks like it's a fair, because it's an algorithm. But you can select the one that might produce the consequences that are inequitable. And so it's a magic trick. And that's where like your bad faith folks can kind of say, hey, we did the right thing or whatever, but secretly they're like, no, we knew what was going to happen. But then there's also good faith folks who, they just don't know about it. It's like, oh, it's fair. Look, we follow the rules. And that's the tricky part is how do you get to a place to where that trick doesn't fly anymore, where you can't hide behind an algorithm, in 2021 in America and say, oh, this is, it's just their fault or whatever, and ignoring the entire history of how we got here.
Yeah, this is where the philosophical concept comes in, because I was watching this video. I love Vox videos. And I watched this video about how algorithms could be biased and could be like perpetuating racism on social media. And I was just like, I don't understand how. Like, that must be a symptom of the masses being racist, right? Because everything's based on clicks and based on views and based on time spent on a post, right? But then I kind of questioned, if that's the case, like, why is, specifically Black culture exploited so much in marketing if it wasn't an adequate way of attracting attention, right? So there's a lot deeper like analysis there that I feel like is beyond what I really understand, that I just think about all the time. Like, how are we using, you said algorithms, and that to me is such a catchword. It's kind of like this dark cyber fear that I have, is like how people are using our data to control how we think beyond a certain point. And can it be influenced even more so to the point where we don't even have a choice?
Yeah. And I want to highlight, like, folks are writing books on this. So Sophia Nobel, I think that's how her name is. Algorithms of Oppression is the book, and talks a lot about how search engines are populated with negative images of Black women in particular, or Black girls. And, again, Google can come out and say, oh, it's just what people are interested in, or whatever, and then ignore the different user experience. Again, somebody who's getting to know themselves as like a young girl or whatever, where they type in these things and they get wildly different kinds of results. And she's thinking about, how do we generate the language to like interact more ethically with these algorithms and filter things. But Google doesn't want. Google's such a problematic company right now. But there are folks doing work to kind of document, people hiding behind algorithms and then pretending like, oh, well, whatever the consequences are, that's just what people want. And it's like, that's not how any of this works. Like, but it's hard because, like, you got to talk about, like, there's so much jargon, but which is a problem. And eventually you need a society that understands that, just because it's an algorithm doesn't mean you've solved everything. Just because it's not a human doesn't mean it's not biased. And that's a tough message to get across.
Yeah. And, I watched this movie called The Big Hack about how, like, Cambridge Analytica, right? And how utilizing data, I guess, back in 2018, probably 2017, became more valuable than oil globally, and how it was used as a commodity, and it was even at a certain point used to influence nation building and how certain elections were run. And that definitely kept me awake. But it helped me to kind of look at things with a different level of understanding. I hope that as these books are being written, and as we're studying how we study, and as we look at how we market and talk to people and how we analyze people through their data, I hope that we're teaching the next generation how to kind of take the curtain off of their eyes so that they can't be pandered to as easily, and that in the future we can let these mistakes that we're making today in how we prioritize funding at different schools and how we, turn a blind eye to certain environmental issues and things like that. I hope that the repercussions of all this will be a heightened sense of curiosity for the next generation to have real connected information that's holistic and not just skewed to give us the answers that we want to hear. Like, don't just blindly follow that post, even if it sounds good, even if you like what that politician is saying. Like, don't click on everything that gets sent your way in an ad. We have to be smarter, but it just feels like we're racing against the clock because people are outsmarting us by using technology that everyday people don't have access to,
Well, I'm gonna. This might be a good time to share my screen real quick. I'm gonna pull up some of those. All right, let me see here. So actually, a lot of this technology is available, and it's free, and it's just emerging. But it's hard to train still, right? So like this is we talked about demographics the other day, but like this is like what data analysis tools look like. So getting familiar with, what does an algorithm do? What does this look like behind? Because you want to reveal that it's not magic. Like this is climate data. This is looking at, deviations from, the norm. And I can download that from NASA. And in a couple lines of code, suddenly, I have the power to graph this and I can look at it and I can analyze this. And this is like easy enough. I've taught middle schoolers like how to analyze this data and kind of show that when somebody comes at you and says, oh, I have the data or whatever, you could do this too. You're planting seeds that this has gotten to the point where you can participate in this if you want to. And you build up. So like this, we select our library, our tool, and that's free. You read that data file that we downloaded from NASA, and then we send the climate data into a plot and we tell it to put points on the graph. This is doable. We could be, spinning up programs to like teach activists or students even like, hey, you're allowed to participate in this cyberpunk dystopia, right? Like you could get exposed to some of this language. But yeah, there's a couple other things if we're interested
this is so abstract to me because I've never been exposed to this, but I wish more industries had to be held accountable to the point where they collected metrics, and then we would have just an endless resource of data to download and add into this type of platform. Like currently, besides NASA, like where else could you go and find information that you really need?
Well, that's the project that we're in, like kind of that I see right now is the best way I can describe it is it's like we're building the plumbing. So we need to build pipes to make this easier to use to where it becomes realistic for like your 6th or 7th grade teacher, to pick it up. And this is essentially a calculator, right? It just is fancy, and it is difficult to get installed and everything. But if somebody is there and facilitated, you can expose a kid to some pretty powerful concepts. And data visualization especially is, I found, kind of fun programming because you get to immediately see something that you're interested in. One student I worked with wanted to create avocado memes, and they downloaded like the price data for avocados, and we did that. it's kind of like a little taste of, I think, where maybe we might want to be going, but it's hard to like sell something like this because, like you said, it's still a little bit foreign, and it would take, maybe a couple hours to kind of show, but it's very powerful and it's free, and I think this is like kind of the direction that we need to go to get people with equipped with the language that they need to recognize discrimination or oppression, or just to learn about the world.
Well, the thing so this reminds me a little bit of GIS, like mapping, but because you said it's like a calculator, that means it must be able to show trajectory and like trends. And,
oh yeah,
you probably can quantify like, okay, if the crime rate in this area is very high and the dropout rate in high school is this high, if we don't invest money by this time to, expand upon resources to help the school system and these children get everything that they need in order to really thrive at school, and the crime rate trajectory mixed with the trajectory of the future population and the development that we're seeing is probably going to go up by this high, right? Like you could probably see that. You can build trends.
You can start doing stuff like that. Again, this is where it's like, oh, we should do a class, but I'm kind of weird because like I want to expand like knowledge about this so that we can deprioritize certain analyses and then up the importance of others. So like some numbers should matter more, some numbers should matter less, and it's really hard to make the case for which is which unless you're talking with somebody else who is familiar with not everything, because you don't have to be an expert at everything, but like some of the language. Like, because, again, that instinct to draw, oh, this is associated with that. This is associated with that. And you build up a sophisticated analysis like that. It's not that that's not useful. It's just, and when you get to the psychosocial, like psychological, sociological, economic, or whatever, there are just so many moving parts. And that idea that you can just come up with the perfect association and then that's enough to convince people to do it, it's dubious. But when you're working with climate, again, like that's very easy to kind of see that, oh yeah, we don't have that in order. So like the numbers used to understand climate, that's a safer thing to be doing some math in than that psychosocial, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, it feels as though it might be very tangible because it's not really like behavior. It's a physical thing that you can measure. You can measure sea level rise, you can measure temperature. I think maybe this tool is, maybe you're saying, limited right now based on how we collect and store and share data. But in order to see like future behaviors of like migration, it sounds like this would be something that soon we could take those data points based on, people leaving. Like right now, I think that's how we actually started talking was, there's such a population boom here. And a lot of people are moving here at a record rate. And I was trying to really wrap my mind around, is it our fault by overdeveloping our natural areas, or is it related to climate change at all? And how would we be able to use that argument if we're not directly connecting somewhere in some database that the people from California with the fires, or the people from, Louisiana with the hurricane, or, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, or Australia, with the fires there. If we're not directly mapping that, we're just looking at where these travesties are taking place, then a lot could be because of climate change that we're not even saying yet. We're not even saying, like, it might be fuel to the fire at the end of the day right now. Because I know in Orange County, we're seeing mass amounts of deforestation taking place and overdevelopment, and we're building housing that's kind of unaffordable and unattainable in urban sprawl, but that's another conversation. We're building this housing that's just like so rapid, and we're seeing that the demand is increasing. That could be a symptom of climate change. But without the data, like, how could you change and influence policy if you can't directly correlate that? And if we're not talking to each other on a global scale, then, and we're just looking at each case that comes in and making a decision just based on that isolated case of a development, then we're in some big trouble.
Yeah, this is, it really is like a moment of truth kind of thing. And you're familiar with Star Wars, right? Maybe, or a little bit.
My boyfriend is a Star Wars trivia nerd.
The scene where, like, Luke, you turned off your targeting computer. What's wrong, kind of thing. Or it's silly, but at a certain point, like, that precision that you feel with analyzing data or whatever, it gets in the way of doing what you need to do. Like, this is like, I could point to this graph, and I need to, I would tell folks, like, folks, this is real. This is coming up, and this is unprecedented.
Yep.
And there are tipping points, thresholds, or where things get beyond where our models were built. And when that happens, it's very difficult to say, beyond keeping a record of data or whatever, but to say, oh, the data are going to be the answer to how we should, behave politically, or what we should build. And again, this, like, you almost sound crazy because you're diverting so far from, like, the established culture of how we make management decisions. But is it like a Noah's Ark situation where you need to build the capacity, where we have all these folks living on the coast, and that water is going to come calling, and it's very, folks are going to be freaked out when you start talking about this, because we've invested so much, and people's lives are there, but we're all adjusting, and we're all trying to make sense of what's coming in, and because of the situation, what's appropriate is, okay, expand the scope of your thinking. This is a problem we've never seen before. This isn't as simple as, like, monitoring the stars in the sky.
Yeah.
Where it's just regular behavior, and that's why climate folks are so freaked out. Because you get to a point where it's just, the best thing is, the best analysis is like, oh, this is going to get weird, and that requires a completely different way, I think, of understanding your analysis task and how you tell stories, and that's, like, weird for me as, like, a data analyst, to, like, tell people, where it's like, okay, well, we have this data, but your motivation needs, that we have the climate data. I want you to pay attention to that. The psychosocial stuff, you might need to break free from old habits about how you're approaching organizing. And Kimmerer goes into this, and a lot of other psychologists that I like. Narratives and stories are key, I think, to motivating folks to realize, hey, this is a drastically different scene. It calls for drastically different actions. It calls for, you need to really think about who you are, and who I need to think about who I am, and what we want to be able to do. What skills are you trying to accumulate? And
I love the sweetgrass analysis. Send me that book, because
yeah, absolutely.
if we were in tune with our ecosystem, we wouldn't need data to tell us something's wrong. We wouldn't be so codependent on, you know, the scientific communities scrutinizing the, information that countries are seeing and things like that. We would be able to feel it and to use our heightened sense of connectivity to our surroundings and to nature in order to see that something's very not well. And I think a lot of people do, but if we're all just kind of playing it cool, like, yeah, we have time, we could just like use our reusable straws and like get solar and all these things, and it's just kind of like it'll all work itself out. But it's not that. And we have to have that like moment, like you said, where we just say maybe everything we've been doing has been wrong. Maybe we never should have used nature as a commodity, in the first place, and bought and sold it like it was an item rather than like a part of us. It's basically enslaving ourselves by selling land and by mowing it and degrading it, and it's just a heavy topic that, the whole reason why I created this show that I'm going to be, interviewing people is that people want to have these conversations. They just don't know where to start, and it's really uncomfortable, and they don't know how to always, understand it. So I see how data can be used to communicate in a different language for people to understand. But when it's exploited and used for evil or purposefully, skewed in a way so that we get a means to an end, it can be very detrimental to our survival.
Yeah, and Kimmerer is big on participating in different language communities, and she writes about her struggle. Am I a poet? Am I a botanist? Am I, in this new American side, or am I Potawatomi? And she's reviving like languages again in schools where the idea was to snuff out the language, and in order to participate in modern society, you got to learn English, and we lost a lot of wisdom and stories. She talks about how even grammar, or the form of language, changes your relationship with the other beings in your environment, and the other things in your environment, or who counts as a being and who counts as a thing. And I got so attached to this because like I started out as a musician, and then am doing like this data stuff, and like and it's like an identity crisis, because it's like, oh, there's big problems I need to help. I can't just go play piano all day. And you feel a little bit lost, a little bit. But as you pick up these different languages, it's funny how I bring stuff back to the piano, or I bring the piano to like data, or again, it's weird to explain, but like so like I'm big on grammar now. Like I think grammar is super powerful. The graphs that I'm showing are they use what's called a grammar of graphics, and it's a way of thinking about I want to map certain data to certain characteristic of a graph. So I want the continent to be color coded. I want the population size to be, and let me show you this. I'll show you this other one real quick.
Well, I couldn't help but notice that you had a map upside down in your decor in the background. I was wondering if that had anything to do with.
That is south up. It is not upside down.
South up.
Different perspective. Yes.
I love that.
We got to see things in different ways sometimes, and you notice things.
Yeah.
Can you see this bubble chart? Okay, or is it showing up?
Still see the.
Okay, hang on. I think I know what's going on. All right. So this is great for talking about language here.
Because data it's like a form of language. It's
It
a way to
absolutely
communicate
is.
to people.
Yes.
Just like music. I don't know if you saw Soul, but
I did.
that was awesome.
I may have cried a little bit at
Yeah,
one
I
point.
cried too.
Happy tears, but so this is like one of my favorite graphs. It's there's a Swedish professor who did public communications, and this is kind of what got me onto this, because he was very excited and kind of told a story about what's called like a demographic transition. So each dot is a different country. They are color coded by continent. On the x-axis, we have the average births per women in that country. And then on the y-axis, we have the life expectancy at birth. And this is kind of just the briefest explanation of what's been going on in the world for the last 200 years. It strips out a lot of important details, but the life expectancy at birth and how many births you have and how many people there are. You start to see European countries, they're taking advantage of the resources that they've gained in colonial projects, and their life expectancy is starting to go up. So they have better public health programs. Infants are starting to die less, and so that they get to live longer there. But then, other countries start to catch up. Where technology, so the life expectancy goes up before the births come down. And then slowly there's like a convergence where even the colonial projects, like the life expectancy is going up.
So crazy. And Africa has so overwhelmingly more points on this graph that are much lower and behind the other progress, the progress of other continents. And it's one of the most exploited continents, though, for all the other continents to be able to move forward and achieve greater things.
Right, because like the colonization in late 1800s and early 1900s picked up. And this doesn't show any kind of measure of wealth, although you could get that data and you kind of see that it's not as great. But the life expectancy still is coming up. The births are coming down, which is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Different cultures have different expectations or whatever, but they are kind of coming down. And that is, in other data sets, you start to see education going up. But there's a grammar for exploring these stories. And, if we were going to talk more about this, you also need those narratives of exploitation to make sense of it. But you can, all right, let me go back. You can go.
I would love to see that with different species of animals.
Oh, yeah.
To see how their birth rates and life expectancies are influenced by humans going up. I would pay money for somebody to put that together for me.
There are, those projects do exist, and maybe you'll do one day, or maybe I'll do one. But this grammar, you add layers to the plot. You map, one thing to the X, one thing to the Y, one thing to the size, one thing to the color. It's a very well planned out language that you can still make mistakes, but it's obvious when there's like a grammatical problem. And another grammar that I love, so this is like if you wanted to create a PDF document with like this software, this is what it looks like. But this grammar that says, okay, this is another theorist named Ken Burke. When we act, our motivations can be described by a grammar. We find ourselves in a scene. We are an agent. We have an agency. There's an attitude, a purpose, and an act. And that grammar, I think, can help describe to where some of these things are going wrong, to like where if your purpose for acting is to just collect data, like if that's how you structure your school, if that's how you structure your government or whatever, if it drifts away from, okay, making sure that somebody's actually in a house, making sure that they're actually fed, as you drift away, it's like a grammatical error. And so it's like a check. Are we, did this become like a pathological reliance on data to motivate our decision making? Did we somehow slip? That's, that power of language that I found, inspired by Kimmer in particular, but other theorists too. To where it's like, how do you explain, why things are going so bad? What are we motivated by, and how could we recalibrate that?
Well, I am so grateful that you took this time to chat with me about these in-depth, really detailed conversations about data and how it influences our society and all these things. I think we should probably do another one of these one day.
I'm down.
Because I think there's other factors that, like distribution of wealth to me is directly correlated with quality of life.
Yeah.
Across the world, but in America specifically.
Yeah.
And so I just thank you. And do you have any closing sentiments for those who are watching?
Stay kind, stay curious, and try to surprise yourself. I think so much of what's going on is just, and again, we had a whole other conversations, but you get into a rut, and we're all, stressed out to the max. Sometimes it's nice to just sit, and just, sit with the moment, recalibrate, reconnect with, the world, reconnect with other people, or connect for the first time. We are in this together.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to do a follow-up.
Thank you so much, Lee. I'm glad we finally got to talk. So.
Yay. Awesome. Thanks.